Welcome back. And in this video, what we want to do is we want to talk about a fourth type of tissue, and that being nerve tissue. Okay. Previously, we talked about in another video epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues, are coverings or linings where we have a lot of cells that are very tightly packed to create this covering or lining. We talked about connective tissue and the different forms of connective tissue. Characteristic about connective tissue are there are very few cells and a lot of matrix, which is that ground substance, as well as fibers. Hold things together. And again, connective tissues do largely what? They connect, as well as blood, bone, ligament, tendon, fat, loose connective tissue, loose areolar tissue, number of different forms of connective tissue. We also talked about muscle tissue, and muscle tissue, either skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, or smooth muscle, has the ability that, regardless of how it's made, it's able to shorten in length or contract, which produces some type of motion. Okay, striated versus the stripe, which is we see in cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle, or non-striated, which you see in smooth muscle. And this fourth type of tissue we have is called nerve tissue. The nerve tissue is a type of a tissue that allows a connection between two sometimes very remote areas. Okay, sometimes signals will start at one end and transmitted away from the brain. Sometimes things start at the other end and transmitted towards the brain. We'll talk about afferent versus efferent in a little bit. But this nerve tissue, whether it's going away from the brain or towards the brain, is able to carry a certain impulse. Okay, this nerve impulse is going to go either one way or the other. Okay, usually because of a change in the ion structure inside and outside the nerve cell itself, but it's able to send a signal, and again, sometimes over very long areas. Again, we'll talk a little bit how that happens in just a second. When we look at the tissues, though, in the particular cell, with these neurons, we know carrying and that conduct an impulse, they have what's called a cell body. And the cell body is the area where we have our nucleus, and sort of like the main part of a neuron. Okay, sometimes signals will originate from there. Sometimes signals will come from somewhere else and go back to the cell body, who will actually then send it somewhere else, send that signal somewhere else, such as in the brain or whatever the case may be. But cell body is a major portion of that cell, of that neuron, has a nucleus and major things like that. From that cell body, we have a number of different appendages which actually come off that cell body. Sometimes off the cell body, there'll be like little spokes that'll come off the cell body, and from that there'll be little feelers that are going to go out, from the area of that cell body. And these are called dendrites. And these are actually able to allow communication from one neuron to another neuron. Okay, so they carry impulses. Sometimes they'll get signals from other neurons and they bring it in, so the cell body can decide what to do with it, whether it has to send it somewhere else or whatever the case may be. These are called dendrites. They're very easy to see microscopically. We also have axons. Now, axon is the long filament. Well, it could be long, could be short, but many of them are very long. And this is basically that's carrying impulses. It says here away, but it's also towards the cell body. Okay, so it's a long filament that either is carrying impulses away from the cell body or towards the cell body, coming from the periphery and sensory input going back towards the cell body. Okay. And these are called axons, okay? And they could be, again, quite long. They could be very short. That might just be connecting two neurons, one neuron to another neuron, just sort of like a little jumper cable between the two. Or they could be really long, like some neurons that may start in the brain, they actually get into the spinal cord, they'll cross over, they mate with another neuron, and then from that they send another long neuron, which may go all the way to the tip of your big toe with a very long axon. Okay. Finally, when I get to the end of the axon, I end up what's called the nerve ending or nerve terminal. Okay, and that ending or nerve terminal either could be a place where the signal will end up at, such as what's called a myoneural junction. When we talk about muscle function and muscle contraction, we'll realize that what happens is the signal starts in the brain, goes down a series of motor neurons, it gets to the area of the muscle, and and at the end of that, it's almost like that nerve ending or the terminal sits in a little gap or a cleft right in the area of the muscle. It's able to send that signal from the nerve to the muscle to cause the muscle to contract. And those are some type of nerve endings we have. Other nerve endings may be things such as they're embedded in the skin or the walls of organs and vessels that actually detect either a stretch or pressure or temperature. They will then send that signal through the axon back up towards the cell body and towards the brain. Okay, so these are called nerve endings or nerve terminals. We have another type of neuron. It's called the neuroglia. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. But the neuroglia, neuro means nerve and glia means glue, okay, as in medical terms. And basically this is supposedly a nerve, a cell that's sort of like that holds and supports other neurons, okay. I think things are changing a little bit in regards to the philosophy as to what neuroglia may do, but they're not as well structured as the rest of the nerves. Most neurons in the brain or in the spinal cord come in various tracks, okay, where the neuroglia sort of like are amorphous. They're all over the place, okay, which makes it sometimes when they get it into a problem, a big significant pain in the rear end, okay, with that. So when we talk about neurons, okay, if we look at the picture over here on the, or the diagram on the right side, this area in here, that would be the area of the cell body. That would be the cell body sitting up in here. And again, the nucleus is sitting inside there, nucleus is sitting inside there, and that's the cell body, okay? And from that cell body, I have, in this case, I have an axon, which is this long filament that leaves the cell body that's going to go down to a nerve ending down in here, okay? Now, these axons, or these neurons, could be what's called multipolar, bipolar, or unipolar. Now, this one up in here, this one right here, is a unipolar. This is a unipolar, because why? It only has one pole, it's only going one direction. This one down here is called bipolar, because what happens is we start with the axon here, but the axon may go this way and may go this way. It's going in two different directions. If I had other axons that would come out of there, it would be called multipolar, okay? So multipolar, unipolar, bipolar makes sense. It depends upon the number of axons, okay? We also have what are called interneurons, okay? And these interneurons are actually a lot of neurons in the body. They're sort of shorter connecting neurons. They connect one thing to another, okay? So some of these neurons can be quite long. Some of them are just connecting neurons, okay? And then we have these neuroglia, like I mentioned before. They're smaller than neurons, but they're very, very numerous. Like I say, they're amorphous. Where most neurons travel in groups, they like to hunt in packs, okay? They'll be in bundles. And so what happens is between these bundles, they have to be filled with this material, and that's called that's the neuroglia, okay? In fact, in the past, they just thought they were like nerve glue. They just held one nerve to another nerve. I think some of the more recent discussion of neuroglia is that they may be able to transmit some type of electrical impulse to allow that better communication between one neuron and another neuron, okay? The fact that they are so amorphous and they're all over the place, they're spread, it's not like they're bundled together, okay? Makes them very difficult in regards to managing. There's a particular a cancer of the brain which is called a neuroglioma, okay? And what happens in these situations, the glial cells become involved. They're very difficult to handle because they're all over the place. You can't really control where they are, okay? So basically, so they may have some ability to be able to propagate or generate an action potential, which is that nerve conduction, or the electrical signal that goes down the nerve. At least that's what some of the people are thinking now may be actually happening. But its major purpose is to be able to fill spaces formerly occupied by neurons. And they are also able to multiply. They're able to divide, which also makes a problem if they become cancerous. They divide rapidly, and usually the lifespan, if somebody has a glioblastoma or something like that, which is a malignant cancer of the brain, lifespan is usually about a year and a half. It's very, very short. John McCain was one of these people. Teddy Kennedy was one of these people. I have a cousin who passed away after probably about 9 months after this, okay? But it's because they rapidly multiply, they fill space, they're all over, they're amorphous, and they other than that, they're not the main type of neural type cell that we have, okay? Now, this is just looking at a couple of nice things. This is a little diagram from the upper right, and you can actually see the cell body right here. The nucleus sits in there, and this area would be the axon. That would be the nerve ending. These little areas that stick out right here from the sides, okay, are the areas that we call dendrites. And again, those are the ones that allow communication with other associated or nearby neurons, okay? And they're called the dendrites. They look like little feelers. You can see up here the little fingers that come off inside there. And if I look over on this is actually a pretty nice picture. I like this this picture over here, you see a cell body in here. Okay, this whole thing is a cell body. You see all these little filaments that come around here? Those are the dendrites. They're coming out. If you look like right here, these are all dendrites. They're coming out of that cell body. The cells. A lot of these neural cells, they look almost like squamous cells, or they'll be they'll be pointy, little pointy with the dendrites coming out the sides like that. Okay, so you see that. If I look at this one up in here, I'm almost assuming that this one right here, this part right here, is probably part of an axon that's coming out. Okay, but the axon would be this long tail, that's that long cord that goes to wherever the neuron wants to go. So basically, this is what the neural tissue would look like if you were looking at it on the microscope on the picture on the left. Okay, let me just get rid of all those my extemporaneous drawings. That's what it looks like. And you see all those cell bodies with the nucleus inside the cell body. These little spokes pointing out from it with the little feelers, and those little feelers are called dendrites. And if you see a long tract leaving it, that would be the area of the axon. Okay, this is another picture that actually looks, it's pretty good. So you see the cell body. You know, if you look right in here, here's the cell body right here. Here's the axon. You're losing it up in here because it's going into a different plane. This area right here would be the dendrites, the little feelers that are sticking out from the side, the little dendrites that are there. Here's another nerve, which probably communicating with that neuron with its dendrites, but that's that. Here's the cell body up in here. There's the nucleus, the nucleolus, and stuff like that. Axon is leaving. Here's another cell body. This is where the dendrites are coming off. So here's another cell body. You can't see the nucleus here, but these areas where the dendrites would be coming off. Okay, so basically, I know I have a cell body. Everybody should know what the cell body looks like. I have the axon, which is long, so the cell body would be up in here. The dendrites are coming off the cell body, little feelers like, and then I have the axon, and nerve ending or nerve terminal would be down at the far end. Okay, here's another great picture. Okay, I like this one too as well. These are actually sort of pretty nice. I like those. So here's the cell body right there. The nucleus would be right in here. It's hard to tell when you see these which is going to be an axon, which is going to be the area of the dendrites. Obviously, this is a dendrite. That's probably dendrites. That's probably dendrite. This is probably the axon. I don't know. This is probably the axon right here. These are all probably dendrites coming off on that side. Okay, here's another one. This would be the axon up in here. You would probably most likely think, and these are dendrites. Here's the cell body. Here's the nucleus. Okay, so that should be pretty easy to see. And again, everything in between are these smaller little things, which would be those neuroglial cells. Here's another great picture. I like this as well. See the cell bodies in here, and you see the dendrites coming off, cell dendrites. This would be the axon, I would think, right in that one right there. And here's again all these little glial cells, all these little spokes in between. You know, cell body, and you see all the little points coming off the dendrites. Okay, so that's basically what we see when we look at these nerve cells. Here's another one, cell body. Here's the nucleus right in here. The nucleolus is sitting right there. These are all glial cells. Everywhere else around the outside. Here are the dendrites coming off the sides. This is probably the axon, I guess, I would think. You know, this is probably the axon going on wherever it's going to go. The dendrites coming off the side, cell body, nucleus. Okay, so I think you get the picture as to what this looks like, what this cell body would look like, and what that axon would look like. If you actually get a cross section, I should have put this in here, but I didn't. I'll have to try to find a picture and put it up on Blackboard. But if you look at the cross section of the spinal cord, these I'm actually catching the nerve at the right plane. But if I have the spinal cord, you know, which is going to look like, you know, it's going to look like this. There'll be a darker area in the middle like this, you know, and stuff like that. You're actually catching, and all you see is a bunch of little spots all over the place. They're usually in like little tubes because I'm actually catching the nerve in a cross section. Okay, this is a little bit more about, here's the nucleus nucleolus, here's the axon right there, cell body, more cell body. I like this one here though, but you can see right here, okay, and I'm just going to outline it. Let me get rid of that and make a bigger circle here. Okay, that's an axon right there, and what they've done is they caught it. If this was like the axon like this, they actually caught it across this way. So you're seeing it, looking at it down at the end of it. Oops, let me get that. Yep, there we go. Looking right down at the end of it. You can see that that would be the the axon going into the screen, okay, as compared to being parallel to the screen like we see with the cell bodies and stuff like that. You can see that side. Yeah, and what happens is the axon, we'll talk more about this when we talk about nerve a little bit later. The axon sometimes is surrounded by a sheath around the outside, okay? There'll be a sheath. It's like this. And the sheath is called a myelin sheath. It wraps all the way around. It looks like it, it's like it doesn't, but it wraps all the way around, okay? And this myelin sheath, nerves are axons which are myelinated, travel faster. So the impulse speed is much faster down nerves that are myelinated. And we'll talk a little bit about how that happens. And what happens is the nerve conduction jumps from node to node to node to node very fast, okay? And that's what happens with myelinated nerves. Here are some nerve fibers you see here, 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 here. These are all nerve fibers. This is actually almost like where you look at everything in a cross section, like I talked about. You're looking at down like the end of wherever it's at. So that's the axon, that's the axon, that's axon, that's an axon. So all these little circles in here are axons, and we're catching it as if we've actually taken that, if that nerve was like this, and cut it across, just like that. So you have that circle appearance of that nerve, okay? And that's called the axon. Those are the axons. Now, what's the function of the nervous system? We'll talk a lot more about this later on down the road when we actually talk about nervous system function. And basically, there are a number of different things that the nervous system does, and it's sort of amazing. It's a multitasker, okay? Sensory function. What the nervous system does is it's really important in detecting all time of internal and external stimuli so the body can make responses to it. In an earlier presentation, we talked about something called homeostasis, which will come up in just a second. And the body needs to know what's right and what's wrong. And the only way it knows what's right and what's wrong is by being able to detect these internal and external stimuli. If something goes a little bit off the tracks, guess what? Now we know that the nervous system can identify that. So basically, this is what we call sensory function, able to detect internal and external stimuli. And these are what we call afferent nerves, okay? We talked about this briefly in a previous PowerPoint. Afferent means going towards something, going towards or going to something. So afferent nerves, what happens is if I take a needle and stick my tip of my finger, that signal goes from the tip of my finger, that pain signal goes from the tip of my finger up my arm, it goes to my brain. It's going towards my brain. So because it's going towards my brain or to my brain from the outside, it's called afferent. Afferent. Remember that. That's a very important word. We're going to hear this in multiple times in multiple places. Okay. Afferent. Afferent means going towards something. Okay. We also know, let's jump to the bottom. We also know what we have is we have motor function. Motor function, these fibers are called efferent. They're leaving the brain. And what happens is motor function is the brain will send a signal, sometimes voluntary, like moving a muscle or something like that, sometimes involuntary, such as creating certain muscles to change in size, which would be involuntary or autonomic nervous system. So what happens is they're able to produce a response with motor activity, either voluntarily or involuntarily, to make something happen down the road, okay? And basically what happens, this is called an efferent, these are called efferent nerves because where afferent goes towards something, such as going towards the brain, efferent starts in the brain as is going away, okay? It's going out away from the brain. So efferent means away from. What happens is then that efferent nerve ends at something called an effector, which might be a muscle, which might be a skeletal muscle, which might be a smooth muscle in the wall of a vessel, and that's going to cause a response, okay? So motor function, sensory function, detecting a stimulus, letting the brain know. Motor function, something from the brain telling an effector what to do somewhere down the road. We also have neurons that are involved in what we call integrative function, okay? And what happens is these are neurons, because of their connections, they're able to analyze and store input to be able to make an appropriate response, okay? When we talked about homeostasis, if something is out of whack, this sends a signal to the brain, and certain areas of the brain, particularly the hypothalamus is going to be a very important one, is able to have neurons in there that will able to interpret, is this right or is this wrong? And if it's wrong, it sends out a motor response to do something to make a change. Okay, so this is what we have with integrative function. Analysis and storage of neurons for appropriate response out by an efferent nerve that will cause some type of effect. Okay, we also have the integrative with these inner neurons. Again, these are the short neurons we talked about before that are able to connect other neurons in the brain. So they're able to communicate with each other. They're able to work together, okay, synergistically. And that's what we talk about, this integrative function and these inner neurons. Okay, so, and again, this is getting back to our good old friend homeostasis. And homeostasis is a simple process to understand, okay? It means that the body doesn't like things to be different. It wants things to be the same all the time. It doesn't like to deviate from what's normal. And the way it does this is receptors detect some type of a stimulus. That stimulus is transmitted to the brain. The brain says, is it right? It's analyzed or processed in the brain in the appropriate region, and there are multiple regions. A lot of it's in the hypothalamus, okay? It's processed and analyzed in the brain, and if it's right, let it go. Hey, it's fine, no problem, we're good. You know, just keep at it, do the same thing. However, if it's wrong, it sends a message sent to an effector to initiate a change to get back to what's normal, okay? And that's basically what homeostasis is. Now, when we talked about homeostasis before, there are two ways we could get homeostatic control. One's by the neurological system. So neuro, okay, that's supposed to be neuro, okay, and that's fast, immediate response. Why? Because it just sends out a signal by this nerve and it's done. You know, it's something that you can't wait for a response. It's fast. The other system that actually is involved with homeostasis is the endocrine system. In the endocrine system, what happens is the nervous system stimulates the endocrine system. The endocrine system with glands, these glands make various things called hormones. And then the hormones are released into the blood. Then this makes it even longer. What happens is the hormones are made, released into the blood, okay, to make a change. They're released, they circulate throughout the body. They go to a target organ. And they produce an effect at that target organ. The target organ will produce some type of effect to actually get you back. The problem is it's slow. It's slower. So if I want a really fast change, the neurological system. If I want a slower change, the endocrine system is appropriate. Okay, and that's all has to do with the body's responsiveness. And we've talked about this before when we talked about body characteristics. It's to be able to detect and respond to changes in the internal and external environment. Okay, and that's what we call homeostasis. Again, receptors, and how the nervous system comes into that is this nervous system sends signals either towards the brain or away from the brain by these what are called action potentials. And these action potentials are basically electrical signals through that nerve. Okay, and it causes a change, and that's what we talked about with homeostasis. Okay, now what are some of these sensory receptors? Let me get rid of my picture down here so you can see all this. What are some of the sensory receptors? Couple microscopic things that we would be able to see. We have what are called free nerve endings. Okay, and these free nerve endings are basically bare dendrites and nerve endings that are embedded within certain walls of organs, within walls of blood vessels, within walls of some of the airways of the lung, within the skin, okay, and they may determine things such as, particularly in the skin, things such as pain, temperature, tickle, itch, some touch, and things like that. The majority of these are peripherally, like in the skin, okay. We also have what are called encapsulated nerve endings. And basically, instead of having a free nerve ending that's just sitting out there free and just blowing in the wind, we have dendrites that are enclosed in a little connective tissue capsule. Okay, they're surrounded by connective tissue capsule. And this is what we see with touch. These are much easier to see when we start to look at skin. I'll show you some example of some of these Meissner's corpuscles in just a little bit. And basically, these are called encapsulated nerve endings. And then we also have some sensory nerves or sensory receptors that are called separate. They're separate from anything else. And basically, they're receptors, you know, that synapse then with a neuron. In other words, these receptors are separate. They're not part of that nerve, but what they do is they have a stimulus or an input on what's called a first order neuron, or the first neuron right next to that. And this is what we see in the eye, in the retina, which we call photoreceptors. On the back of the eye, there are receptors that will detect chemical changes, and because of light changes that hit the back of the retina, will cause a chemical change, which then signals a first order neuron to send a signal back to the back part of my brain, or what's called the occipital lobe, where my vision centers are, so I could actually interpret that as vision. The inner ear has hair cells. When I go in the inner ear, there's a thing that's called the cochlea. And the cochlea looks like a conch shell. It has about 2.5 turns, and it's filled with a fluid. It's very, very small, but it's filled with a fluid. And along that, there's membranes. And on these membranes are small little hairs with sometimes with little buds at the tip of them. Okay, at the very tip, that will bend and they'll move. And those actually are when we have a fluid wave that's transmitted through that inner ear, because what happens, sound waves hit the eardrum, cause the eardrum to vibrate, causes a vibration of all the little bones that go through the middle ear, that hammer, anvil, stirrup, or the malleus, incus, and stapes, okay, that actually causes another membrane at the inner ear to start to vibrate, which creates a fluid wave that goes down those curves of that cochlea. It causes these inner hair cells to be stimulated, and that's what hearing is all about. It's that simple. Okay, I say everything's that simple, but it's actually much more complicated, but it sounds that simple. We also have taste buds, and taste buds, or gustatory receptor cells, are basically small little receptors on the surface of my tongue that will be able to discriminate between various different types of taste: sour, sweet, bitter, stuff like that. Okay, and those are called taste buds. Those are also sensory receptors. Okay. Also, when we look at receptors, we have receptors which are called exteroreceptors. Okay. Exteroreceptors are receptors which are at or near the surface of the body, and they're detecting external stimulus, because our body has to be in harmony with our environment. Okay. So they're at or near the surface of the body, and they detect stimulus from outside the body and the external environment. Okay. Things such as smell, taste, touch, pressure, vibration, thermal or temperature, and pain are basically what we call external receptors. They're really at the surface of the skin, very close to just underneath the skin, or receptors that are able to determine what my external environment are. Okay. Interoreceptors are a little bit different. These are internal receptors. These are like in blood vessels, in the walls of blood vessels, in the walls of my organs, because viscera means organ, and with the nervous system. And what they do is they are actually receptors that get stimuli from the internal environment. Okay, such as stretch of a vessel, or if I take and I fill my stomach with food, the wall of my stomach will stretch, which then sends a signal that actually does a lot of things. It actually starts my motion of the intestines, the peristalsis, to work faster to get rid of stuff that's in my intestine, because stuff is coming down from the stomach. Okay, so these are called interoreceptors. We generally aren't. These don't. We can't perceive these a whole lot. If I touch something that's hot, I know it's hot. But if something stretches something on the inside of my abdomen, I really don't feel these a lot. There's not a lot of sensation that I get from that, but they are picking up stretch and things like that. So they're generally not really felt. The third type of receptor I get are what are called proprioceptors. Okay, proprioceptors are really, really important. And proprioceptors are actually nerve sensory receptors that are in muscles, tendons, in joints, and also in the inner ear, but mostly muscles, tendons, and joints. In the inner ear is involved with balance. Okay, in muscles, tendons, and joints, it actually sends a signal to my brain to tell me exactly what position that joint is in. So in other words, sometimes if you ever sprained your ankle, you're walking down the street, and all of a sudden your foot twists underneath, and your body tries to put your foot back underneath your body so it doesn't turn in. but sometimes it's not fast enough. And sometimes that's an error of the proprioceptors to be able to send a fast enough signal up to the brain so the brain could say, hey, let's get the foot underneath the body by causing certain muscles to contract. So I know that when I was in practice, since I did a lot of sports medicine, we did a lot of proprioceptive training after things like ankle sprains and stuff like that, simply to try to rebuild these proprioceptors, which actually tell you body position, muscle length and tension. Muscles are constantly moving, and what they do is they finally get to a point which is called muscle tone. Muscles are always constantly in a little bit of contraction, okay? But what they usually do is they overshoot, they go back, and they keep on going back until it's sort of like a big, I can't. And it gets finally where it gets to the right point. So these proprioceptive fibers in muscle determine the length. So the length of a muscle is appropriate. Again, joint position, joint motion, equilibrium, which is both involving the inner ear as well as in muscles, tendons, and joints. Okay. If you want to test that out, just stand up on one leg. And what happens is you can feel the muscles constantly moving. And that's because what happens is I'm getting two impulses. I'm getting visual as well as signals from my ear, as well as the proprioceptors from my joints. They're actually trying to make it so that I can keep my body upright without falling. Okay. If I close my eyes, it becomes much more difficult because I'm only relying upon the proprioceptors in my joints as well as a little bit from the equilibrium from the inner ear. Okay. So these are called sensory receptors that we have. Okay, we have a lot of different types of sensory receptors. Okay, mechanoreceptors. Mechanoreceptors are basically, they detect mechanical pressure, touch, pressure, vibration, again, proprioception, hearing, equilibrium, stretch of blood vessels, and stuff like that. They detect some type of stretch or pressure or something like that. Okay, as compared to thermoreceptors. Thermoreceptors they're looking at temperature. It's only temperature. Okay, and so we have mechanoreceptors, we have thermoreceptors, we have nociceptors. Okay, nociceptors are responsive to certain types of chemicals that are released that actually produce pain. Things such as prostaglandins, bradykinins, and stuff like that. What happens is when I have tissue damage, okay, or tissue injury, some of these chemicals accumulate in those tissues, and that causes pain. Why? Because it stimulates these nociceptors that basically send a signal that because of this chemical influence upon them, they send a signal to the brain saying, hey, that's painful. Okay, so they're called nociceptors or nociceptors. Photoreceptors. Okay, photoreceptors basically pick up the light that hits the retina. Okay, so they cause a chemical change in those receptors in the area of the retina that will actually stimulate that electrical signal through neurons that go back to the area of the back side of my brain, to my visual cortex. Chemoreceptors. Okay, chemoreceptors basically are receptors that are sensitive to various chemicals such as taste. Okay, when we look at the taste buds, there's a whole science which is a taste science where they have scientists working in labs that create certain chemicals that produce a certain taste. Why does two things that are basically the same taste differently? Why? Because they add these chemicals to various foods that we eat to give them a different taste. Okay, so and that's because of the chemical that actually does so. Some of these taste buds are responsive to these chemicals and they respond differently. Okay, also same thing happens with smell. With the smell, our olfactory means smell. Our olfactory nerves are at the very top of the roof of my nose, which is actually quite high, and basically they just detect various chemicals that are in the air, and that produces a certain smell. Okay, also certain body fluids can be detected by chemoreceptors. And osmoreceptors, these detect osmotic pressure or pressure of fluids. Okay, and basically that's what osmoreceptors have to do with. So these are different types of sensory receptors. And if we look at the skin, Again, we can have free versus encapsulated. Encapsulated just means it's inside some type of a fibrous capsule, the nerve ending, as compared to free, where basically we just have free nerve endings around the areas of, there's a hair and certain the skin and stuff like that. But these are things: height, heat, encapsulated; light touch, encapsulated; pain, encapsulated; cold, encapsulated; stuff like that; strong pressure, encapsulated; stuff like that. So different types of free versus encapsulated, and they can be at different levels. This area out in here is the epidermis. This area in here, the dermis would be in here. There's all subcutaneous tissue down there. That does make sense. Don't worry about that. Okay. And this is just a couple, microscope images that show the difference. This right here, if you look right here, see, this look like a little bean in this area right here. If you look right here, looks like a little bean right there. That's called a Meissner's corpuscle, which is basically a tactile mechanoreceptor. It detects pressure. And if you look down in here, this is a free nerve ending. This actually coming down here. And again, this would be the epidermis, the darker brown. Where down in here, the lighter is going to be the dermis. Okay, so the epidermis is the brown, the dermis is below that. And you can see this this is just a nerve that's coming up this way. Basically, this is the nerve coming up this way. It's just a free nerve ending. Okay. So what we've talked about today is a little bit about nerve tissue. In this video, we talked about there's a cell body, and a cell body is where the nucleus is. It's sort of like the major functioning area of the nerve. However, we have to send signals, and the purpose of a nerve is to be able to send signals, either short distance or long distances, by an electric type of a signal. Okay, we'll talk about that later on when we get to the nervous system. And that's called an axon. This long tail, this long filament that connects the nerve body, the cell body with the very end of the nerve ending is called the axon. At the cell body is able to communicate with other surrounding nerves by dendrites, little feelers that are around there. And then finally, I get down to the end of the axon. At the end of the axon, I get a nerve ending. And there are a number of types of nerve endings. See, some are encapsulated, some are free nerve endings and are sensory nerves, and some of them actually will embed themselves. They don't really embed themselves, but they sort of sit like in a little cleft or a little ditch, okay, at the surface of a muscle that will actually then the signal that comes down the nerve is transmitted to the cell membrane, the sarcolemma on the muscle, that actually causes electrical activity to occur on that causes that muscle contraction, which we'll talk about later on. Okay, so that's a little bit about nerves, a little about the structure of nerve. Hopefully they'll fill you in a little bit more, you understand it a little bit more. And again, as always, if you have any questions, make sure you ask about any questions you might have. Other than that, for the same thing as I always say, be safe and be healthy. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.